Okay, everyone, we'll get started now. My name is Kate de Gennaro. I'm a planning specialist with Texas Sea Grant. Welcome to another Seaside Chat. I think this is our fourth chat so far. We're going to start off with a quick poll collection just to collect some information about our viewers. So Kimber, can you bring up that poll question? There we go. This information is just used within our organization. We'll have one question at the beginning and I think two questions at the end. Give you a minute or so to fill out the poll question. I've been working with Texas Sea Grant since 2016. I worked on a few projects in Aransas County and the Coastal Bend region, but now I live in Brownsville and I work mostly in the Rio Grande Valley region. I realize there will be a variety of people joining us today, and it may seem like this presentation is geared toward community planners or other types of government staff, and in a way it is, but as a planner, I always encourage more public participation in the planning process. So if you fit into the public category, I hope you will learn something about the planning process today and that you'll feel more comfortable and willing to participate in a public meeting. Your voice really matters to us. You can bring some really important information about your neighborhood or a community group that the government staff might not be familiar with. I'm going to share my screen now. So I'll be talking about community assessments and social vulnerability. Social vulnerability is a term that has been used in the context of community resilience and disaster management for quite some time. And throughout this pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about the more vulnerable segments of our society. Some of that vulnerability relates to health, but some of it I would consider social vulnerability. So when I get to explaining that in more detail, I'll try to connect the dots between the natural disaster circumstances and the circumstances we've been seeing with the pandemic. I'm going to start with a little information about the Community Resilience Collaborative. I'm pretty sure most of you are somewhat familiar with Texas Sea Grant, especially if you've been following us on social media, but you may not know about the Community Resilience Collaborative, or CRC for short. It is a program within Texas Sea Grant that partners with other Texas A&M University organizations and departments, such as Texas Target Communities, the Department of Landscape, Architecture, and Urban Planning, the Institute for Sustainable Communities, and the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center. We have several urban and community planners, planning specialists, and a natural resources specialist on staff. Our main goals are for communities to adopt plans that are locally defined and bring sustainable solutions to development, and for communities to increase their resilience through planning and education. We aim to have habitats and ecosystem services monitored, enhanced, or restored, and we want to bring local ground truth knowledge together with scientific knowledge for planning and decision-making purposes. One of the resources that I would like to highlight is the Beyond the Basics website. The web address is actually mitigationguide.org. It focuses on hazard mitigation, and it will walk you through several steps or tasks for the planning process, but it also gives a lot of best practices from various communities across the nation. I'll be focusing on task 5 here, which is to conduct a risk assessment. Some of the terms I put on this slide are used interchangeably, but for this presentation, I want to define them. So community assets are the people, the structures, the facilities and systems that bring value to a community. Vulnerability is made up of the characteristics that make those assets susceptible to damage or disruption from disasters. Risk is the potential for damage, disruption, loss, or other impacts, which can be measured by a risk assessment, which assigns values for the purpose of planning and decision-making. Everyone loves Venn diagrams, so I put this Venn diagram, which shows how risk is where hazards and assets overlap. When conducting a risk assessment, it's pretty common to measure the extent of hazards, the source or cause of flooding, how often it floods, the depth and velocity of flood waters. I'm using flooding as an example, but you can also measure the precipitation amount for snowstorms or the size of hail. You can measure the temperature for extreme heat situations. And the Saffir-Simpson scale is typically used to categorize hurricanes and wind speeds. Defining community assets and their vulnerability may be a little more complicated than the extent of hazards, and sometimes it is easy to overlook some assets. So we'll walk through how to define some community assets. When it comes to inventorying the built environment, we should think about which buildings are located in the floodplain and how many times have those buildings been flooded. Repetitive loss is becoming a bigger and bigger issue the more frequent our big storms are happening. So we should also consider the age and construction standards of buildings. Building codes continue to change over the years because there are engineers and specialists that provide newer and stronger standards all the time. However, it is recognized that it's often difficult to bring homes up to current codes for physical and for financial reasons. This difficulty extends to historical and structural and cultural structures sometimes. So here we have the Strand in the city of Galveston, which was severely flooded during Hurricane Ike and was probably flooded in storms that happened after Hurricane Ike. And this is the Fulton Mansion in Aransas County, which sustained some wind damage during Hurricane Harvey. Both of these structures provide a lot of cultural identity to these cities, so they require special attention when planning for hazards. Other parts of the built environment include critical facilities, and they are the facilities that a community has to have to continue operating. So electricity is a really obvious one. Roads and bridges can be washed out or blocked by storm debris. And public transportation is for people who do not own cars. We also want to think about what areas within a community are seeing lots of new development and will need future infrastructure. So how are we including this future development into our hazard and emergency planning and decision-making? Besides the built environment, we also want to look at the economic players in a community. So where are the small businesses located? This is a photo of the Rockport Heritage District, which has several blocks of small businesses. The locations are super relevant in the context of hazards and the floodplain, but we're also seeing how badly small businesses are affected during this pandemic. When the owners are also the main shopkeepers or employees, and they have to stay home with their kids or their parents, there is no one to keep the shop open, and then the business can suffer. The same can be true if a shop owner cannot live in their home because of storm damage, and they are temporarily staying in another city. Communities have other commercial centers and major employers that could be disrupted if their supplies do not arrive or if their products cannot be delivered. This happens after disasters, but it has been happening during the pandemic as well. In rural areas, we can't forget ranching and agriculture, which are major players within the economy. The natural environment is also a major asset in most communities. In coastal areas, dunes and barrier islands can take the brunt of a storm before hitting the housing. In bay areas and riverine communities and along the coast, there are wetlands that can also absorb the force of flash floods and storm surge. Wetlands can also help filter and improve water quality, and wetlands are also the home to vast amounts of wildlife. Last but not least, we need to identify the people or the social capital of a community. So where do most of the people live? Where do most people work? We also want to look at if there is a large college population in town or another institution. We can look at the major festivals that are happening in a community and if there are a lot of tourists drawn to that community. We've actually seen a lot of conferences and festivals and tourism and colleges all impacted by the pandemic. So all these conditions need to be incorporated into a community's hazard planning, whether it's a natural hazard, a technological hazard, or a health hazard. For hazard planning, particularly evacuation planning, we also want to think about people with access and functional needs, such as those with disabilities and hearing and seeing impairments. Hospitals and other medical services are sometimes considered social capital, but sometimes are considered critical facilities as well. This photo is of some volunteers at a food bank. Social services such as food banks can be vital after a natural disaster when there have been power outages and people have lost all their food, or they can't store new groceries and they can't cook food. But we've also been seeing food banks as a vital service during the pandemic because some people haven't been working and they can't afford to buy food for their families. The last bullet point here refers to population growth, which mirrors development of the built environment. So what types of people are moving to all those new houses that are being built, and what are their demographics? Thinking about demographics leads me straight to social vulnerability. Here's another Venn diagram that I pulled from this book, Planning for Community Resilience, a handbook for reducing vulnerability to disasters. Some of our partners published this book in 2014. It is a great resource for making community assessments with regard to risk and vulnerability. It has best practices and even worksheets for communities who are thinking about hazard mitigation and planning for resilience. So I talked a little bit about hazard exposure and measuring the extent of hazards, and I talked about the built and natural environments. So now I'll talk more about social capital and social vulnerability. There are actually 9 to 10 common characteristics that people usually use when talking about social vulnerability. Income, household size, race, ethnicity, primary language spoken, education, transportation modes, housing tenure, mobility, and age. These characteristics tend to determine a person's or a household's capacity for handling disasters. When I say capacity, I mean how well does that person receive information? How much power or control do they have over their circumstances? And what resources do they have to prepare for or recover from events that disrupt their lives? Differences in capacity can then lead to disparities in preparedness, response, and recovery. Some examples I'm thinking about are if someone has a mobility impairment or if they depend on public transportation, how easy is it for them to evacuate or to return home after the storm? Another example is if someone rents an apartment and their building is severely damaged by a storm, how much control do they have over when the building gets repaired or if the building will be demolished? Another example is if they don't speak English well, are they misunderstanding information that is only provided in English? And another good example is if they live in an older home and they haven't been able to afford the upkeep or to meet newer building standards, how well will their home withstand the storm? And how will they be able to afford repairs after the storm? These disparities impact individuals directly, but collectively they can impact the whole community as well. For example, the city of Rockport saw some cascading effects after Hurricane Harvey. Rockport is known as a fantastic tourist spot in the summer, but also for winter Texans. In fact, a lot of the city's economy is based on tourism. So when Harvey hit, there was extensive damage to lower income housing, which prevented a lot of the workforce from returning home. Some of those people temporarily couldn't return home, and some of them didn't return home permanently. So this segment of the workforce supported the restaurants, the shops, and other tourist venues. And when they didn't return home, those businesses couldn't reopen or couldn't maintain their normal working hours. So the economy took a big hit across the whole city. Now I'm going to go back to that website, Beyond the Basics, and show a couple of examples that it provided for identifying socially vulnerable groups. You might not be able to see these tables very well, but the King County example shows the percentage of the population that doesn't speak English well, the percentage for disabled, elderly, and children in grade school, and it shows the percentage of homes that are over 40 years old. The Hartford example on the right shows affordable housing units, how many elderly and disabled people live in those units, and it shows mobile home parks and homeless shelters as well. Besides writing out these tables and percentages, it's also a good idea to map these conditions and characteristics within a community. The Hazard and Reduction Center at A&M University has this really cool interactive map online called the Texas Coastal Planning Atlas. If you're going to Google it, I strongly suggest you use HRRC in your search, because that should bring up this webpage with the evacuation studies on it. It should be the top option in your search. So there are 2 evacuation studies, one for the Rio Grande Valley, which was put out in 2015, and one for the Coastal Bend region, which was completed just last year. I'm going to show some maps for the Rio Grande Valley region, particularly Cameron County, because that's where I live. So all of these maps will show hotspots for whatever characteristics, whatever social vulnerable characteristics you're looking for. This first map is for rental units, and you can see a few hotspots. There's one in eastern Harlingen, and there's one along the border, the Mexican border in Brownsville. The next map is for elderly households, and a hotspot has popped up in the San Benito area, which is just south of Harlingen. And we still see another hotspot along the border in Brownsville. This pink map shows the population that does not speak English well. I want to point out South Padre Island on the right, because this map shows that there's no shading for this characteristic on South Padre Island, whereas the other maps had at least some shading for rental units and elderly folks in South Padre. Likewise, on this map, for people without a vehicle, we're still seeing hotspots in other cities, but South Padre Island doesn't have any shading for people without a vehicle. The last map, unfortunately, shows all the housing built before 1990, which is at that 40-year mark. And you can see how the shading and the hotspots really grew across all of the communities. This mapping application from the Hazard Center has a lot of other layers you can look at, such as flood zones, surge zones, and previous windstorm data. You can actually look up your evacuation zone and what evacuation routes might be blocked during different levels of storm surge. So this mapping application is not only useful for community planners and emergency management personnel, but it's also useful for just an average citizen. Another good source of tools is the NOAA Digital Coast. Here you can type in different words into the search bar and it'll spit out a variety of tools that should be helpful for planning and decision making. The last website I will share is gulftree.org, which will actually guide you through your search. So you can click on some overarching topics, and then you can drill down a little bit more. You can choose a state and a county or a region within the state. Finally, you can choose the level of effort you will put in. I kind of look at this as more like how familiar are you with different kinds of data. If you're more familiar with stuff, you'll probably be able to put in a higher level of effort. But if you're not as familiar with data, you might only be able to put in, you might only put in a lower level of effort. So once you've made all your selections, then it will also give you a list of tools that may be helpful. So that's all I have to present today. I think we have some time for questions, if there are any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now.
All right, we do have one question. Are houses built pre-1940 considered subpar construction? If so, why?
I think there have been waves in construction standards, so I'm not completely familiar with the construction standards that are pre-1940 versus like pre-1960 or 1980. So I can't answer that question with expertise, but you can talk to your building official from your community and see how those standards have changed over time and what kind of improvements you might want to make.
Well, I'll give a few more minutes for questions. But before then, while we wait for questions, we'll introduce another poll that we would like for y'all to answer. Okay, Kate, I haven't seen any other questions come in, but we're still in the process of having people vote. So I'll turn it back over to you.
I think I can share my screen again just in case anybody wants my email address. There we go. And the website there is there for the CRC as well. Oh, it looks like we have another question. Can we look up our community's vulnerability online? If you think about those characteristics that I shared, a lot of those characteristics are measured by the census. So if you go to the census website, you'll be able to get data for some of those characteristics, probably most of those characteristics. Actually, I think they're tracking all of those things now. But also if you go to the Hazard Center mapping application that I shared, it shows everything on a map, but there's also an option where you can click on an area and then open up the attribute table, and it will show you the data for whatever characteristic you have mapped and whatever particular area you're looking at. So there are a couple of different ways to look up vulnerability online. Thanks for asking some good questions, Tony. Kimber, does it look like we've got all our answers for the poll?
Yes, Tony just said you're welcome. Yep, and looks like we have most of the poll answers. So.
Okay, well, I guess we'll end a little early here. Again, if anybody has any other questions, they want to get in contact with me about anything, just feel free to email me. I'm glad that everyone joined the Seaside Chat today, and we'll be having more coming up. I think every other week we have a Seaside Chat going on.
Yes, thank you, Kate. And thank you to everybody who came. We have these chats every other week, so appreciate you all. Thank you.
Hopefully we'll see you in another couple of weeks.